Hey everyone, this is Gary. This week I'm going on my first proper vacation in several years, and the first since I launched this podcast almost 4 years ago. As I'm going to be away from the microphone this week, I've lined up some shows from the archives that most of you haven't heard, and if you did, it'll be a good refresher. I'll be back again with new episodes on September 9th. If you think of the First World War, your mind probably turns to images of trench warfare and thousands of men losing their lives just trying to gain a few meters of land. However, in the first few weeks of the war, this was not the case at all. In fact, it initially looked like the war might not even last for 2 months. What stopped the collapse of France and began widespread trench warfare was a desperate battle that took place in the first week of September 1914. Learn more about the First Battle of the Marne on this episode of Everything Everywhere Daily. This episode is sponsored by NerdWallet.
Nerds!
When it comes to general knowledge and history, you know I've got you covered. But who do you turn to when you need smart financial decisions? If your answer is NerdWallet, then you're absolutely right. And if it's not, let me change your mind. The nerds at NerdWallet have spent thousands of hours researching and reviewing over 1,300 financial products. And they have the tools you need to make smarter financial decisions. Looking for a credit card? Go beyond the basic comparisons, filter for features that matter to you, and read in-depth reviews. Ready to choose a high-yield savings account? Get access to exclusive deals and compare rates, bonuses, and more. House hunting? View today's top mortgage rates for your home sweet home. Make the Nerds your go-to resource for smart financial decisions. Head to nerdwallet.com/learn more. NerdWallet. Finance smarter. Disclosure: NerdWallet Compare Incorporated, NMLS 1617539. This episode is sponsored by ButcherBox. Doing a daily podcast means spending a lot of time sitting at my computer, researching and recording. To be honest, there have been days that I've been unable to leave the house to go get something to eat, or if I do remember, it's often too late and everything is closed. This is just another reason why I love ButcherBox. They send frozen, high-quality meats and seafoods directly to my door, so I always have something that I can make in my freezer. Whether it's my famous Scotch eggs, a meatloaf, or just cooking up a steak in my cast iron frying pan, ButcherBox's home delivery makes it easy. With ButcherBox, I don't have to sacrifice quality for convenience. If you leave a busy life and are looking for good food for your family with the ease of home delivery, then you have to try ButcherBox. Sign up for ButcherBox today by going to butcherbox.com/daily and use code DAILY at checkout to get $30 off your first box. Again, that's butcherbox.com/daily and use code DAILY. It's hard to express just how differently the First World War might have turned out if events had proceeded just a little differently in the first weeks of the war. When war broke out, Germany was far more prepared than any of the other Allied powers. In a previous episode, I went over the German plan for the war, which was known as the Schlieffen Plan. The Schlieffen Plan had been years in the making and was a highly detailed plan for what Germany would do in the opening weeks of a war with France. The creator of the plan, Field Marshal Alfred von Schlieffen, knew that if a war broke out between France and Germany, and it turned into a war of attrition, Germany would eventually lose. He felt that Germany had a window of about 6 weeks to take care of France before Russia could mobilize and threaten them from the east. He also realized that things had changed dramatically since the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. The movement of troops wasn't limited to how fast men could walk or a horse could gallop anymore. There were now trains and automobiles which could move large numbers of men, equipment, and artillery very quickly across long distances. Schlieffen didn't live long enough to see his plan put into action. It was Helmuth von Moltke, chief of the German General Staff, who was responsible for the execution of the plan when the war started. The plan was extremely detailed and made a lot of assumptions, some of which turned out not to be true. For example, they assumed that the Belgians wouldn't put up any resistance at all, which they did, and they didn't even plan for the British being there. Nonetheless, despite the setbacks, the Germans were in control during the first month of the war. From August 3, 1914, when Germany declared war on France, they had been relentlessly advancing, and the Allies had been falling back. The British and French forces were engaged in what became known as the Great Retreat during the month of August and early September. By September 1st, the British Expeditionary Force was considering falling back to the coast so they could evacuate back to Great Britain. The Germans had been sending airplanes over Paris to drop bombs on the city. And granted, there were no real bombers at this point in the war, and they didn't do much damage, but it was a huge psychological blow to the Parisians. The next day, on September 2nd, planes flew over Paris dropping leaflets that said, quote, "There is nothing you can do but surrender." The French government fled the city for Bordeaux, taking all of the gold from the central bank with them. Officials at the Louvre began packing up works of art to be sent to Toulouse. That day, German units crossed the Marne River, which were on the outskirts of the city of Meaux, only 25 miles from Paris. Parisians were now clamoring for Paris to be declared an open city, abandoning all defenses to avoid destruction and loss of life, and allowing the Germans to simply occupy it. The military governor of Paris, General Joseph Simon Gallieni, predicted that if nothing was done, Paris would be lost by September 5th. Paris and France needed a miracle. And on September 3rd, they got their miracle. The Germans had changed their attack plans. The German First Army, led by General Alexander von Kluck, had changed their direction. The First Army was supposed to be the lead army, but von Moltke changed his mind, and now the Second Army was to take the lead, with the First Army, led by von Kluck, protecting their flank. Von Kluck decided to ignore the order and chase the French Fifth Army across the Marne, turning southeast. However, von Kluck went too far. He outran his supply lines, and after a month of advancing, his units were exhausted. And most importantly, he had exposed his right flank by turning southeast. The French used this opportunity to halt their retreat and order a counterattack. On September 5th, the commander-in-chief of the French military, Joseph Joffre, ordered the attack. And this was the do-or-die moment for the French. In his order, Joffre told all of the counterattacking units, quote, "At the moment when this battle upon which hangs the fate of France is about to begin, all must remember that the time for looking back is past. Every effort must be concentrated on attacking and throwing the enemy back." End quote. He also had to plead with the British to take part in the action, as he had no authority over the British Expeditionary Force. He personally went to the British headquarters to plead with the head of the British force, the ironically named Field Marshal John French. He was so desperate for the British to rejoin the fight, he reportedly banged his fist on a table and shouted, quote, "Monsieur le Maréchal, the honor of England is at stake." General Michel Joseph Magnery led his French Sixth Army against the exposed flank of the German First Army. As von Kluck wheeled around to meet the French, he left a 30-mile wide gap between the German First and Second Armies. The French exploited this gap and poured troops into it, creating a 100-mile wide front along the Marne River Valley. This was an odd mix of new warfare techniques using radio communications and airplane spotters, as well as old warfare involving cavalry attacks. Given the proximity to Paris, the French were able to bring in fresh troops using an unorthodox means of military transportation: taxis. 600 Parisian taxis managed to bring approximately 6,000 soldiers to the front lines. Each taxi carried 5 soldiers per trip. The taxis left at night and were ordered to run with their headlights off and only their rear lights on. So each taxi was to just follow the lights of the car ahead of them. This was the first time in the history of warfare that automobiles were used to transport troops to a battle en masse. These taxis became known as Taxi de la Marne, and each taxi ran with its meter running, and the cab fare of 70,012 francs was fully paid by the French government. The British, too, advanced and managed to capture bridges across the Marne River, but moved much slower than the French, despite having an even larger numerical advantage. The counterattack and influx of new troops managed to stop the Germans, and on September 9th, they began to retreat to the north to a position on the Aisne River in northern France. The German retreat was slow. Rainstorms turned the landscape into mud, and it took 3 days for the Germans to retreat to their new line near the Aisne River. In the orders issued by von Moltke to the retreating units was a relatively innocuous-sounding line that set the stage for the next 4 years of war. He said, quote, "The line so reached will be fortified and defended." By September 12th, the Battle of the Marne, now dubbed the Miracle of the Marne, was over, but the war was now really just getting started. With the Germans now in a fortified position on the Aisne River, they began to execute von Moltke's order by digging trenches. The trenches were not designed to be permanent structures initially. For the next month, from September 17th to October 19th, both sides kept trying to outflank each other. It became known as the Race to the Sea, as the flanking maneuvers continued until they ran out of space. Neither side was able to get a decisive advantage, and both sides began to dig in, creating a long front that extended across the entirety of northern France and Belgium. The Battle of the Marne took the lives of over 100,000 soldiers in just a few days, and was a taste of what the next few years of war were to look like. When von Moltke issued the order for the Germans to retreat, he knew that the Schlieffen Plan had failed. It had almost worked, coming within 25 miles of Paris. The failure of the Schlieffen Plan, for which he had been given responsibility, caused him to have a nervous breakdown and be replaced. When he knew it had failed, he reportedly sent a telegram to Kaiser Wilhelm saying, "Sir, we have lost the war." However, the war was not lost, at least not yet. Von Moltke knew what von Schlieffen knew decades before when the plan was first concocted. If Germany were involved in a two-front war of attrition, they would eventually lose. It was just a matter of time. The German high command dug in, thinking that the war was still theirs to be won, albeit with a different script than with what they started. Although no one could have known it at the moment, the aftermath of the Battle of the Marne set the stage for the bloody trench warfare which would define the rest of the war. I previously did an episode on the greatest battles in world history, and I placed the First Battle of the Marne on that list. It was not because it was the bloodiest battle of the First World War, but rather because it created the conditions for the rest of the war. As the historian Barbara Tuchman wrote in her landmark 1962 book, The Guns of August, quote, "The Battle of the Marne was one of the decisive battles of the world, not because it determined that Germany would eventually lose or the Allies ultimately win the war, but because it determined that the war would go on. There was no looking back," Joffre told the soldiers on the eve. Afterward, there was no turning back. The nations were caught in a trap made during the first 30 days out of battles that failed to be decisive, a trap from which there was, and has been, no exit. The executive producer of Everything Everywhere Daily is Charles Daniel. The associate producers are Benji Long and Cameron Kieffer. I want to give a big shout out to everyone who supports the show over on Patreon, including the show's producers. Your support helps me put out a show every single day. And also, Patreon is currently the only place where Everything Everywhere Daily merchandise is available to the top tier of supporters. If you'd like to talk to other listeners of the show and members of the Completionist Club, you can join the Everything Everywhere Daily Facebook group or Discord server. Links to everything are in the show notes.